It was the kind of cold silence that seeps into bones and holds you captive, a silence so thick that even the ticking of clocks sounds like a distant echo. In a towering glass mansion perched on a hill overlooking Chicago's restless skyline, a man sat alone in an empty chair. The clocks were all stopped at 3:07, the exact time when everything changed. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're scrolling through your phone or staring at an old photograph of someone you lost long ago. It doesn't matter what time of day it is, but I promise you, today's story will touch your soul. The September wind whispered through the city below, carrying the scent of dying leaves and distant memories. Henry Benton pressed his palm against the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the world move without him. His reflection stared back, a man of 53 who looked older, his salt-and-pepper hair perfectly styled but his eyes hollow as abandoned wells. The glass was cold against his skin, matching the temperature that seemed to live permanently in his chest. Behind him, the mansion stretched like a museum of frozen time. Persian rugs worth more than most people's homes lay beneath furniture that no one had touched in months. Crystal chandeliers hung motionless, their light casting shadows that danced alone. The silence was broken only by the hum of expensive air conditioning and the occasional creak of settling wood, sounds that reminded Henry he was still breathing, though sometimes he wondered why. His wheelchair sat nearby, a sleek titanium frame that cost more than a luxury car. The accident had taken his ability to walk, but that wasn't the real wound. The real wound was deeper, invisible, eating away at him from the inside like rust on steel. Every morning, he woke hoping the nightmare would end. Every evening, he went to sleep, knowing tomorrow would bring the same suffocating emptiness. The fortune he had built, billions of dollars in real estate investments, stock portfolios that could fund small countries, cryptocurrency holdings that fluctuated like his own heartbeat, meant nothing now. Money had been his language, his weapon, his shield. Now it felt like play money in a game he no longer wanted to play. Henry Benton had not always been a prisoner of silence. Once he had been Chicago's golden boy, a man who could turn vacant lots into gleaming skyscrapers with nothing but vision and relentless determination. He had started with a single rental property in his 20s, bought with money saved from working construction jobs that left his hands raw and his back aching. But Henry had dreams bigger than his circumstances. And dreams, he learned, could be turned into dividends if you were willing to sacrifice everything else. By 30, he owned a dozen properties scattered across the South Side. By 40, his investment firm managed assets worth hundreds of millions. He played the stock market like a master pianist, his fingers dancing across keyboard keys that translated into fortunes won and lost in milliseconds. Bitcoin, when it emerged, became another instrument in his expanding orchestra of wealth. He bought low, sold high, and watched his net worth climb toward numbers that most people couldn't even pronounce. But success came with a price that Henry hadn't calculated in his business plans. The 80-hour work weeks, the missed dinners, the phone calls that interrupted bedtime stories and birthday parties. He told himself he was building something for his family, a legacy, a foundation that would secure their future for generations. What he was really building was a wall between himself and the people he claimed to love most. Sarah, his wife, had been patient for years. She understood ambition because she had married it, chosen it over the safer men who courted her with flowers and poetry instead of stock options and real estate dreams. She raised their son Michael mostly alone, explaining to the boy why Daddy couldn't make it to soccer games or school plays. "He's working for us," she would say, though Henry could hear the exhaustion in her voice during their rare quiet conversations. The mansion on the hill had been Henry's gift to them, a palace of glass and steel with views that stretched to the horizon. Sarah had smiled when he showed her the architect's plans, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "It's beautiful, Henry," she had said, "but what I really want is for you to come home for dinner. Just once without your phone ringing." He promised he would. He always promised. And he always broke those promises for just one more deal, one more opportunity, one more chance to prove that Henry Benton could conquer anything the business world threw at him. The irony wasn't lost on him now. He had spent his life trying to control everything and had ended up controlling nothing that mattered. The accident happened on a Tuesday. Henry remembered because he had been in meetings all day, reviewing quarterly reports and planning a new residential development downtown. Sarah had called 3 times. Michael had a soccer game that afternoon, and she wanted Henry to see their boy play. Henry had glanced at his phone each time it buzzed, but the numbers on his computer screen seemed more urgent than a 9-year-old's game. The call came at 3:07 p.m. Henry had been arguing with a contractor about cost overruns when his assistant knocked on his office door with a face pale as winter sky. There had been an accident. A drunk driver. Sarah and Michael were being rushed to Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Henry's world, built so carefully on foundations of steel and stone, crumbled in less time than it took to speak the words. Sarah died on impact. The doctors told him she wouldn't have felt any pain, as if that somehow made the agony in his chest bearable. Michael survived, but barely. Brain trauma, they said. Coma. The terms floated around Henry like vultures, circling and waiting. His son lay in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed and kept him alive, while Henry sat in a chair beside him, holding a small hand that couldn't squeeze back. Days blended into nights. Henry's business empire continued running without him, managed by capable hands he had trained to think like him. The money kept flowing, investments kept growing, but it all felt like vapor, insubstantial as morning mist. He sold most of his holdings, liquidating assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The money sat in bank accounts, earning interest he would never spend, growing into numbers that mocked him with their uselessness. The drunk driver who caused the accident survived without a scratch. Henry hired the best lawyers money could buy, sought justice with the same relentless focus he had once applied to business deals. But legal victory felt as hollow as everything else. No amount of money could bring Sarah back or wake Michael from his silent sleep. Henry's own injuries were severe, but not life-threatening. Spinal compression, they called it. The surgeons spoke optimistically about recovery, about physical therapy and adaptive equipment. But Henry found that he didn't want to recover. Moving through the world in a wheelchair suited him. It matched the immobility he felt inside, the sense that he was stuck in a moment that would never end. The mansion became his monastery, a place where he could worship his guilt in private. He moved Michael's hospital bed into the sunroom, where morning light could touch his son's sleeping face. The machines came with them, a symphony of electronic beeps that measured Michael's existence in steady, mechanical rhythm. Henry spent his days watching his son breathe, counting the rise and fall of his small chest, waiting for some sign that the boy he loved was still in there somewhere. Visitors came at first, business associates with flowers and carefully worded sympathy cards. Sarah's family, grieving their own loss while trying to bridge the chasm between themselves and Henry's fortress of guilt. But Henry had forgotten how to talk to people who weren't discussing profit margins or market fluctuations. Their condolences felt like foreign languages, and eventually they stopped trying to translate their concern into words he could understand. Now, almost a year later, Henry lived in a world he had created but no longer recognized. The clocks throughout the mansion had stopped at 3:07, some mechanical, some digital, all marking the moment when his life fractured into before and after. He left them that way intentionally, a reminder that time itself had become his enemy. Outside, Chicago pulsed with life, people hurrying to work, children playing in parks, couples walking hand in hand down Michigan Avenue. But inside his glass fortress, Henry existed in a perpetual 3:07, frozen in the amber of his own making. The money continued to accumulate, dividends and interest payments flowing into accounts he rarely checked. His financial advisor called weekly with reports about market performance and investment opportunities, but Henry barely listened. What was the point of growing wealth when there was no one left to share it with? His portfolio could buy buildings but not bring his wife back. His cryptocurrency holdings could purchase luxury cars, but not wake his sleeping son. The September afternoon, when everything began to change, started like all the others. Henry sat in his wheelchair beside Michael's bed, reading aloud from a book about pirates and buried treasure. The doctors said comatose patients could sometimes hear voices, and reading gave Henry something to do besides count the beeps of medical equipment. The story was one of Michael's favorites from before the accident, full of adventure and brave children who overcame impossible odds. As Henry read about a young pirate finding courage in the darkest moment, he heard something that made him stop mid-sentence. Footsteps on gravel, not the measured pace of his part-time nurse or the careful approach of delivery drivers who left packages at the gate. These footsteps were different, lighter, more hesitant, accompanied by the soft scrape of worn sneakers on stone. Henry maneuvered his wheelchair to the window and peered through the glass. A boy stood in his circular driveway, no older than 9 or 10, with dark hair that caught the afternoon sunlight. He wore jeans with patches at the knees and a Chicago Bulls t-shirt that had seen better days. His backpack looked like it had traveled many miles, and his sneakers were the kind you could buy at discount stores, functional but far from fashionable. The boy wasn't looking at the mansion with the awe Henry expected. Instead, he was studying the building with curious eyes, as if trying to solve a puzzle. He adjusted his backpack straps and took a few tentative steps toward the front door, then stopped, seeming to gather courage for whatever brought him to this place. Henry's first instinct was to ignore the visitor. Children from the neighborhood sometimes wandered onto his property, drawn by curiosity or dared by friends to approach the mysterious house on the hill. Usually they took one look at the imposing structure and ran back to safety. But this boy seemed different. He wasn't running. The doorbell echoed through the mansion like a sound from another world. Henry couldn't remember the last time anyone had stood at his front door by choice. He waited, hoping the boy would give up and leave. But the bell rang again, followed by a gentle knocking that was more polite request than demand. Against his better judgment, Henry activated the intercom system that connected to speakers by the front entrance. "This is private property," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You need to leave." There was a pause, then a clear young voice replied, "I'm sorry, sir. I know I shouldn't be bothering you, but I was hoping you might be able to help me with something small. Just something small." The voice was respectful, but unafraid, carrying an accent that placed its owner somewhere in the city's Latino neighborhoods. Henry found himself curious despite his desire to be left alone. "What kind of help?" "I need a used bicycle, sir. Nothing fancy or expensive. Just something that works, so I can ride to school and maybe help my mama with errands. I saved up $15, and I know that probably isn't enough, but I was thinking maybe you might know where I could find one." Henry stared at the intercom speaker, trying to process what he had heard. In a city full of bike shops and online marketplaces, why would a child come to him? More puzzling still, why would anyone think he would care about such a trivial request? His wealth could buy a bicycle factory, but what did that have to do with one boy's simple need? "There are bike shops all over the city," Henry said finally. "Try one of those." "I did, sir, but they're all too expensive, even the used ones. And some of the places, they don't really want to help kids like me. I thought maybe someone who lives in a house like this might know about different places, or maybe have an old bike they don't use anymore." The honesty in the answer caught Henry off guard. He had expected the usual childhood persistence, wheedling or begging designed to wear down adult resistance. Instead, the boy seemed to be presenting his case with the matter-of-fact logic of someone much older. "What's your name?" Henry asked, surprising himself with the question. "Eli Morales, sir. I live down in Pilsen with my mama. She works 2 jobs, so she doesn't have much time for bike shopping, and I don't want to worry her with asking for money for something like this. I figured if I could find a cheap one myself, it would be a nice surprise." Pilsen. Henry knew the neighborhood. a vibrant community southwest of downtown where colorful murals decorated building walls and the smell of fresh tortillas drifted from family restaurants. His real estate investments had touched that area years ago, but he had never spent time there as anything other than a businessman looking at profit potential. The people who lived there worked hard for modest wages, raised families in small apartments, and somehow managed to maintain a sense of community that Henry's mansion lacked entirely. "You walked all the way from Pilsen to ask me about a bicycle?" Henry's voice carried disbelief. "Yes, sir. Well, I took the bus part way, but I've been thinking about this for a while, and I figured it couldn't hurt to ask. My mama always says the worst thing someone can say is no, and that's not so bad." Henry rolled his wheelchair closer to the window, trying to get a better look at this unusual visitor. Eli stood patiently by the front door, not fidgeting or showing signs of impatience. His posture suggested someone comfortable with waiting, a child who had learned that good things sometimes required persistence and time. The September afternoon was cooling, and leaves from the mansion's carefully maintained trees drifted down like natural confetti. Eli watched them fall, occasionally catching one and examining it before letting it go. There was something peaceful in his movements, an acceptance of the world's small beauties that Henry had forgotten how to recognize. Inside the mansion, Michael's medical equipment continued its steady beeping, marking time in mechanical precision. The sound had become background noise to Henry, but now it seemed louder, more insistent, as if demanding attention. He looked back at his son's still face, then at the boy standing in his driveway, and felt something shift inside his chest. Not quite emotion, but the memory of what emotion used to feel like. He pressed the intercom button again. "Eli." "Yes, sir?" "Why did you come here specifically? There are other houses on this street, other people you could ask." There was another pause, longer this time. When Eli spoke, his voice carried a thoughtfulness that seemed beyond his years. "I don't know, exactly. I was walking by, and I saw all the windows, and I thought about how someone who could afford all that glass must be able to see everything, the whole city, maybe the whole world. And I figured someone with that kind of view might understand about wanting to go places, even if it's just around the neighborhood on a bike." The answer was so unexpected that Henry found himself laughing, not with humor, but with the bitter recognition of irony. Here he sat, surrounded by windows that offered panoramic views of Chicago, and he spent his days looking at nothing but the inside of his own prison. A child had seen possibility in his glass walls while Henry saw only barriers. "I could buy you 100 bicycles," he said into the intercom. "New ones, expensive ones. Why settle for something used?" "Because I don't need 100 bicycles, sir. I just need one that works. And sometimes used things have stories, you know? They've been places and done things. New things haven't had adventures yet." Henry stared at the intercom, his laughter dying in his throat. When was the last time anyone had spoken to him about adventures, about the stories that objects could carry? His mansion was full of expensive things, but none of them had stories beyond price tags and investment potential. They were beautiful and costly, and completely lifeless. "Wait there," he heard himself say. "I'm coming down." The trip from the sunroom to the front door took longer than it should have. Henry's wheelchair moved smoothly across the polished floors, but he found himself stopping every few feet, hesitating like someone approaching the edge of a cliff. When was the last time he had opened his front door to a stranger? When was the last time he had opened it to anyone? His hand shook slightly as he turned the locks. 3 of them installed after the accident as part of his transformation into a hermit. The door swung open, and there was Eli Morales, looking even younger and smaller than he had appeared through the window. Up close, Henry could see that the boy's clothes were clean but well worn, the kind of careful presentation that spoke of limited resources managed with dignity. Eli's eyes widened as he took in Henry's wheelchair, but he didn't stare or ask uncomfortable questions. Instead, he offered a smile that seemed to light up the late afternoon shadows. "Thank you for coming to talk to me, Mr. Benton, Henry Benton." "Thank you, Mr. Benton. I know you're probably busy with important things." "Important things." Henry almost laughed again. His days were measured in pages of books read to an unhearing audience, and hours spent staring through windows at a world that moved without him. But there was something in Eli's respectful assumption that stopped him from sharing his bitter assessment of his own significance. "You really walked all the way from Pilsen for a bicycle?" "Well, I've been thinking about it for weeks. My friend Carlos, he has this bike his uncle gave him, and he rides it everywhere. To school, to the store for his abuela, sometimes just around the neighborhood because it feels good to go fast. I watch him, and I think about how nice it would be to help my mama that way, or just to feel like I'm flying sometimes." Eli's face lit up as he spoke about his friend's bike, and Henry could see the longing there, not greedy want, but the pure desire of a child who had discovered something that represented freedom and possibility. It was an expression Henry dimly remembered from his own childhood, before life had taught him that wanting things led to working for them, and working for them led to forgetting why you wanted them in the first place. "Your mother doesn't know you're here." It wasn't a question, and Eli's slight shift in posture confirmed Henry's guess. "She thinks I'm at the library," which is true. I was there, but then I decided to come here on my way home. She worries about me asking people for things. She says we make our own way and don't depend on charity. "But you came anyway." "Yes, sir, because sometimes you have to try, even when you're scared, and I figured if I explained it right, maybe she'd understand that this isn't charity. This is just one person helping another person, which is different." Henry studied the boy's earnest face, trying to remember when he had last met someone who drew such careful distinctions between pride and pragmatism. In his business world, people either asked for things directly or maneuvered to get them without asking. Eli seemed to be doing neither, and both. "I don't have any bicycles," Henry said finally. Eli's face fell slightly, but he nodded with resignation that seemed practiced. "That's okay, Mr. Benton. I figured it was a long shot anyway. But thank you for listening to me. Most adults don't really listen to kids, especially kids they don't know." The observation stung because it was probably true. Henry tried to remember the last time he had really listened to anyone, not just waiting for them to finish talking so he could respond, but actually paying attention to what they were trying to communicate. Even with Michael, before the accident, their conversations had often been distracted. Henry's attention divided between his son's words and whatever business crisis demanded his immediate focus. "But I could get you one," Henry heard himself say. "I could make some phone calls, find you a good used bicycle." Eli's face brightened immediately, then clouded with concern. "I only have $15, Mr. Benton. I know that's not very much." "Keep your $15. Buy something for your mother with it." "But then it would be charity, and I can't—" "It would be an investment," Henry interrupted, surprising himself with the word choice. "I invest in things I think will pay returns. Something tells me investing in your bicycle would pay returns I haven't seen in a long time." Eli tilted his head, considering this. "What kind of returns?" Henry looked at the boy's serious face, at the way he approached their negotiation with the same thoughtful respect he might show to an adult business partner, and felt something warm unfurling in his chest for the first time in months. "The kind that can't be measured in dollars," he said. The afternoon sun was beginning to set behind Chicago's skyline, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the mansion's many windows. Eli glanced at the darkening horizon, then back at Henry with obvious reluctance. "I should probably head home soon. My mama will worry if I'm too late." "Of course, but Eli, come back tomorrow after school. I'll have some information about that bicycle for you." The boy's smile could have powered the city's electrical grid. "Really? You'd do that for me?" "I said I would." "Thank you, Mr. Benton. Thank you so much." Eli carefully shouldered his backpack and started down the driveway, then turned back. "Mr. Benton, I hope you have a really good evening." Henry watched the small figure disappear down the hill toward the bus stop, and for the first time in almost a year, he found himself thinking about tomorrow as something other than another day to endure. Inside the mansion, Michael's medical equipment continued its steady rhythm. But somehow, the sound seemed less like a countdown and more like a heartbeat, the pulse of life that continued even in the deepest darkness. That night, as Henry sat beside his son's bed, reading about pirates and treasure, he found himself wondering what adventures a 9-year-old boy might have on a bicycle through the neighborhoods of Chicago. The story in his hands spoke of courage and friendship, of ordinary children who discovered extraordinary things when they ventured beyond the safe boundaries of their known world. Perhaps, Henry thought, as he closed the book and listened to the familiar sounds of machines keeping his son alive, there were still adventures to be had. Perhaps some treasures couldn't be bought or sold or invested in traditional markets. Perhaps a used bicycle could teach him about returns he had never learned to calculate. Outside his windows, Chicago settled into evening, millions of lights twinkling like earthbound stars. Somewhere in that vast constellation of humanity, a boy named Eli was probably telling his mother about his day, his voice bright with hope and possibility. And for the first time in months, Henry Benton fell asleep thinking about someone other than himself. The next morning brought the kind of September clarity that makes Chicago beautiful, when the late summer heat breaks and the air carries hints of the autumn to come. Henry woke earlier than usual, his mind already turning over the problem Eli had presented: a bicycle. Such a simple request, but as Henry began making phone calls, he discovered that finding the right used bicycle was more complicated than negotiating million-dollar real estate deals. His first call went to his personal assistant, Margaret, who had managed his schedule and various requests for over a decade. She listened to his unusual inquiry with professional composure, though Henry could hear the surprise in her voice when she repeated back his instructions. "You want me to find a good used bicycle suitable for a 9-year-old boy, something reliable but not expensive looking, and you want it delivered here by this afternoon." "That's correct. May I ask, is this for a specific child? Should I include any particular accessories or safety equipment?" Henry paused, realizing he knew very little about Eli's specific needs or preferences beyond the basic request. "It's for a boy who lives in Pilsen. He wants to ride to school and help his mother with errands. Make sure it's safe and in good working condition." "Of course, Mr. Benton. I'll start making calls right away." But as the morning progressed, Margaret called back with frustrating news. The used bicycle market was either too expensive for what Henry had in mind or too cheap to be reliable. Everything in between seemed to be either already sold or located too far away for quick delivery. "I could arrange for a new bicycle," Margaret offered. "There are several retailers who could deliver something appropriate by this afternoon." No, he specifically asked for something used, something with a story. Margaret's pause was brief but telling. In all their years of working together, Henry had never cared about the story behind any purchase. He bought things because they were the best available, the most efficient, or the most profitable. The idea that he would now want something specifically because it had history was as foreign to his established patterns as requesting a meal from a food truck instead of a 5-star restaurant. "I'll keep looking," she promised. While Margaret worked her network of contacts, Henry found himself wheeling through his mansion with new purpose. The building suddenly felt less like a mausoleum and more like a neglected resource. Somewhere in his considerable storage areas, there might be forgotten bicycles from his own childhood or items left behind by previous owners. The mansion had been purchased furnished, part of a package deal that included everything from Persian rugs to kitchen utensils. In the basement, beneath climate-controlled wine storage and exercise equipment he no longer used, Henry discovered a storage area he had barely explored. Boxes and furniture covered by white sheets held the accumulated possessions of lives lived before his ownership. As he moved through the space, his wheelchair navigating carefully between obstacles, he felt like an archaeologist excavating layers of other people's history. Near the back wall, leaning against a stack of boxes, he found it. A bicycle, painted blue but faded with age, its chrome handlebars tarnished but intact. The tires were flat, and the chain showed signs of rust, but the frame appeared solid. A small placard attached to the seat post bore a name written in careful cursive: Michael Thompson, age 10. Henry stared at the name, feeling an odd coincidence settle around him like morning mist. Michael, the same name as his son. He maneuvered closer, examining the bicycle with growing interest. It was exactly the kind of used bike Eli had described, functional rather than flashy, clearly loved and ridden by its previous owner. The paint was scratched in places that suggested real use, adventure, and stories. He called Margaret back. "Cancel the search. I found something." "You found a bicycle? At your home?" "In the basement. It needs some work. New tires, probably a tune-up. But it's perfect." "Should I arrange for it to be repaired?" Henry hesitated, his finger tracing the worn grip of the bicycle's handlebars. When was the last time he had worked with his hands on something real and tangible? His construction days felt like another lifetime, but muscle memory lived in places deeper than conscious thought. "No. I'll take care of it myself." The silence on Margaret's end was longer this time. "You want to repair a bicycle yourself? Is that so strange?" "Mr. Benton, in the 15 years I've worked for you, I've never known you to repair anything personally. You have people for that." Henry laughed, recognizing the truth of her observation. He paid professionals to handle everything from changing light bulbs to maintaining his cars. The idea of personally fixing something as simple as a bicycle would have seemed beneath his station just days ago. Maybe it's time I learned again. The project consumed Henry's afternoon in ways he hadn't expected. Getting the bicycle upstairs required dismantling it partially, a process that reminded him of taking apart machines as a curious child. In his garage, surrounded by tools he had forgotten he owned, he spread the bicycle's components across a clean tarp and began the methodical process of restoration. The work was physical in ways his recent life hadn't been. Even from his wheelchair, he could reach most of the bicycle's parts, his hands remembering motions from decades past. The chain came off easily, soaked in degreaser before being scrubbed clean with an old toothbrush. The tires, when removed, showed minimal wear on the treads despite their age. As he worked, Henry found his mind quieting in ways it rarely did anymore. The constant background noise of worry and guilt that had become his mental soundtrack faded, replaced by the immediate demands of brake cables and gear adjustments. There was something deeply satisfying about problems that could be solved with the correct application of tools and attention. By late afternoon, the bicycle was transformed. New tires gleamed black against the restored blue frame. The chain moved smoothly through gears that shifted with crisp precision. The handlebars, polished until the chrome reflected his face, rose from the frame like the horns of some noble creature ready for adventure. Henry rolled back to examine his work, feeling a pride he hadn't experienced since closing his first major real estate deal. But this was different. That long-ago transaction had been about profit and prestige, about proving his worth in a competitive market. This bicycle represented something harder to quantify, the pleasure of creating rather than acquiring, of giving rather than taking. When Eli arrived just after 4 o'clock, Henry was waiting in the driveway beside the restored bicycle. The boy's face when he saw it was worth every minute Henry had spent with tools and grease stains. His eyes widened, and his mouth formed a perfect O of surprise before breaking into a grin that seemed to illuminate the entire afternoon. "Mr. Benton, is that for me?" "It is, if you want it. I found it in my basement and thought it might work for what you need." Eli approached the bicycle with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts or museum pieces. His hands hovered over the handlebars, not quite touching, as if he couldn't believe it was real. "It's beautiful. The blue is my favorite color, and look how it shines." He finally made contact, gripping the handlebars and giving them an experimental turn. "It feels perfect." "It belonged to another Michael," Henry said, indicating the nameplate he had chosen to leave attached. "Michael Thompson. He was about your age when he rode this bike." Eli read the name carefully, then looked up at Henry with serious eyes. "Do you think he had adventures on it?" "I'm sure he did, and now it's your turn." The boy swung his leg over the seat, and Henry adjusted the height until Eli's feet touched the ground comfortably. Everything fit as if the bicycle had been waiting specifically for this moment, for this child, for this connection between past and present. "Mr. Benton, I need to pay you something. I know you said keep my $15, but that doesn't feel right. This bike is worth way more than $15. Henry watched Eli's earnest face, recognizing the dignity that wouldn't accept charity, even from someone who could afford to give much more. "You're right. This transaction needs to be fair to both of us." He pretended to consider the matter seriously, stroking his chin as if calculating complex financial equations. "I think $15 is exactly right. Because you're not just buying a bicycle, Eli. You're buying the responsibility that comes with it. The promise to take care of it, to use it for good things, to maybe help other people the way this bike is going to help you. That's worth exactly $15. Eli nodded solemnly, understanding that Henry was offering him dignity along with transportation. He carefully pulled the crumpled bills from his pocket and handed them over with the formality of a major business transaction. "Thank you, Mr. Benton. I promise I'll take really good care of it." "I know you will." The boy mounted the bicycle properly and pushed off, wobbling slightly before finding his balance. He rode in careful circles around the mansion's circular driveway, his face glowing with pure joy. Henry watched from his wheelchair, feeling something bloom in his chest that he had almost forgotten existed, the pleasure of watching someone else's happiness, the satisfaction of being responsible for putting that expression on a child's face. After several trips around the driveway, Eli rode back to where Henry waited. "Mr. Benton, would you like to hear something kind of strange?" "What's that?" When I was walking up your hill yesterday, I kept thinking about my papa. He died when I was 6, but before that he used to tell me stories about bicycles. He said they were magic because they could take you anywhere you wanted to go, even if you didn't have money for gas or bus fare. He said freedom was being able to move through the world under your own power. Henry felt his throat tighten. He sounds like a wise man. He was, and I keep thinking he would really like this bike. Not just because it's nice, but because of what you said about responsibility. Papa was big on that. He said when people do good things for you, you have to pass those good things along to someone else. The boy's words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning that Henry was only beginning to understand. Here was a child who instinctively grasped concepts about reciprocity and community that Henry's business education had never covered. The idea of passing good things along, of seeing kindness as something that should flow through people rather than stopping with them. "Your papa sounds like someone I would have liked to meet," Henry said. "I think he would have liked you too, Mr. Benton, especially after seeing what you did with his bike." Eli paused, looking puzzled. "Wait, what did I just say?" "You said his bike, but this bike belonged to Michael Thompson." Eli stared at the nameplate, then back at Henry with eyes that seemed older than his years. "My papa's name was Michael Morales. And this bike. Mr. Benton, how old do you think this bike is?" Henry felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the evening air. He looked at the bicycle with new eyes, noting details he had missed before. The style was from the late 90s or early 2000s. Michael Thompson would be a grown man now, possibly with children of his own. But another Michael, a Michael Morales, had died 3 years ago, when his son Eli was 6 years old. "I don't know," Henry said quietly. "But sometimes the universe has a way of connecting things that seem unconnected." Eli nodded as if this made perfect sense to him. "Mama says Papa is still looking out for me, even if I can't see him. Maybe he led me up this hill." The thought should have seemed fanciful to Henry, the kind of magical thinking he had dismissed as impractical for most of his adult life. But sitting in his driveway, watching a young boy with his father's name riding a bicycle that had belonged to another boy named Michael, Henry found himself wondering if there were forces in the universe that operated outside the boundaries of business plans and investment strategies. "Will you come back tomorrow?" Henry asked. "After school, I mean? To tell me how the bike rides?" "If it's okay with you, Mr. Benton, I'd like that." "It's more than okay. It would make me happy." Eli's smile was like sunrise breaking over Lake Michigan. "Then I'll definitely come back. And Mr. Benton, thank you for listening to me yesterday. Mama always says the first step to getting help is asking for it. But asking is scary. You made it not scary." Henry watched the boy ride down the hill toward the bus stop, the bicycle moving smoothly beneath him like a ship cutting through calm water. As Eli disappeared around the corner, Henry realized that something fundamental had shifted in his relationship with the world. For the first time in almost a year, he was looking forward to tomorrow. Inside the mansion, Michael's medical equipment continued its steady vigil, but the sound no longer seemed quite so much like a countdown to nothing. Instead, it had begun to sound like what it actually was: proof of life continuing, even in the most difficult circumstances. And perhaps, Henry thought as he watched the sun set behind Chicago's skyline, life continuing was its own kind of miracle. The bicycle had cost Henry $15 and an afternoon of work, but it had given him something he hadn't realized he was missing: a sense of purpose beyond his own pain. For the first time since the accident, he had helped solve someone else's problem, and that solving had felt better than any successful investment he could remember. That night, as he read to Michael about pirates finding treasure in unexpected places, Henry found himself thinking about a boy named Eli, riding through the streets of Pilsen on a blue bicycle that had once belonged to another Michael in another time. The story seemed less like fiction and more like prophecy, a tale about the treasures that could be found when people opened their doors to possibility instead of keeping them locked against the world's uncertainties. The days that followed established a rhythm Henry hadn't experienced since childhood: the anticipation of a friend's scheduled arrival. Eli came every afternoon after school, riding his blue bicycle up the hill with the easy confidence of someone who had found his wings. He would park the bike carefully in the circular driveway and spend an hour or two sharing stories about his day, his neighborhood, and the small adventures that filled his life with meaning. Henry discovered that 9-year-old boys were excellent observers of the world around them. Eli noticed things that Henry's adult eyes had learned to filter out: the way morning light turned windows into mirrors, how different dogs in the neighborhood had distinct personalities, the seasonal changes in the trees that lined his route to school. Through Eli's descriptions, Henry began to see Chicago not as a market to be analyzed, but as a living community, full of people with their own stories and struggles. "Mrs. Rodriguez down the street has been walking with a cane this week," Eli reported one afternoon in late September. "I asked her if she was okay, and she said she twisted her ankle but can't afford to miss work, so she's walking to the bus stop anyway. I offered to ride to the store for her if she needed groceries, but she said she was fine. I think sometimes grown-ups say they're fine when they're not really fine." The observation was astute enough to make Henry reconsider his own habit of claiming to be fine when people asked about his well-being. How many times had he dismissed concerned inquiries with automatic responses that revealed nothing about his actual emotional state? "What did you do?" Henry asked. "I rode to the store anyway and bought milk and bread with my allowance money. Then I left them by her door with a note saying they were from the grocery store ferry. She can't be insulted by help from a ferry, right?" Henry stared at the boy, trying to process the casual generosity of the gesture. Eli had solved Mrs. Rodriguez's problem while protecting her dignity, using his limited resources to address someone else's need without expecting recognition or thanks. It was the kind of solution that Henry's business training had never prepared him to recognize, let alone implement. "That was very thoughtful of you." Eli shrugged as if kindness was no more remarkable than breathing. "Papa used to say that when you can help someone without them knowing you helped them, that's the best kind of helping. Because then they don't feel bad about needing help, and you don't feel proud about giving it. It's just neighbors taking care of neighbors." These conversations became the highlight of Henry's days. Through Eli's eyes, he began to understand the difference between charity and community, between helping people and helping with people. The boy never asked Henry for anything beyond their friendship, but his presence began to transform the mansion from a mausoleum into something more like a home. Henry started opening windows to let in fresh air and natural light. He moved Michael's hospital bed to different rooms throughout the day, following the sun so his son could feel warmth on his face. The stopped clocks remained at 3:07, but somehow their frozen faces no longer seemed mocking. Instead, they reminded Henry that while that moment had changed everything, it hadn't ended everything. October brought autumn colors that painted Chicago in shades of gold and crimson. Eli's bicycle rides became scenic tours as he reported on the changing leaves, the preparations for Halloween, and the way his neighborhood celebrated the Day of the Dead with purple and orange marigolds that turned entire blocks into gardens of remembrance. "Mom and I visited Papa's grave yesterday," Eli said during one of their afternoon conversations. "We brought flowers and told him about the bike. I think he would be happy that I'm using it to help people." "You're helping people with your bicycle?" "Oh, yes. Last week I carried Mrs. Chen's groceries in my backpack because her arthritis was acting up. And I've been writing messages between houses for people who don't have cell phones. Plus, I delivered birthday invitations for the little girl next door because her mama was working a double shift. The bike makes everything faster and easier." Henry listened to these accounts with growing amazement. In his business world, tools were used to create profit or competitive advantage. In Eli's world, tools were used to strengthen the connections between people, to solve problems collectively rather than individually. The bicycle had become more than transportation, it was infrastructure for community care. "Have you thought about what you want to be when you grow up?" Henry asked one afternoon as they watched leaves spiral down from the mansion's oak trees. Eli considered the question seriously. "I want to do something that helps people, maybe be a teacher, or work at a hospital, or start a business that makes things people need. Papa used to say that the best jobs are the ones where you go to sleep every night, knowing you made someone's day a little bit better." "Your father sounds like he was a very wise man." "He was, but he was also really funny. He could make Mama laugh even when money was tight or when his back hurt from construction work. He said laughter was free medicine, and everyone should take it every day." Henry tried to remember the last time he had laughed spontaneously, not because something was amusing, but because joy had bubbled up from some deep place inside him. Before the accident, his laughter had usually been social rather than genuine, the kind of practiced response that facilitated business relationships or acknowledged other people's attempts at humor. "Would you like to see something funny?" Henry asked impulsively. Eli's eyes lit up with curiosity. "Sure." Henry led the way to his study, where financial magazines and business newspapers were stacked in neat piles on mahogany shelves. Among them, almost hidden, was a book he hadn't opened in decades, a collection of jokes and cartoons he had received as a college graduation gift from his father. "My dad gave me this when I graduated from business school," Henry explained, pulling the book from its resting place. "He said I should never get so serious about making money that I forgot how to laugh." They spent the next hour reading jokes aloud, some clever and some wonderfully terrible. Eli's laughter was infectious, genuine delight that filled the study with warmth Henry had forgotten his home could contain. When they reached a particularly silly pun about a bicycle that couldn't stand up because it was too tired, both of them dissolved into giggles that echoed through the mansion's usually silent halls. "Mr. Benton," Eli said when their laughter had subsided, "when was the last time you laughed like that?" The question stopped Henry cold. He tried to remember, searching back through months of grief and isolation, but came up empty. "I don't know. It's been a very long time. That's sad, but also kind of wonderful because it means today was special." Henry looked at the boy's earnest face and felt something shift inside his chest, like ice beginning to crack after a long winter. Yes, today was special. As October progressed toward November, Henry began to notice changes in himself that went beyond the simple pleasure of Eli's visits. He slept better, waking naturally with the sunrise instead of lying awake, calculating losses that couldn't be recovered. He started eating meals at regular times, rediscovering tastes that had become meaningless during his months of grief-driven autopilot. More significantly, He began to think about the future as something other than an endless repetition of painful present moments. Eli's stories about his neighborhood sparked Henry's curiosity about the world beyond his mansion's walls. He started reading local newspapers instead of just financial publications, learning about community issues and celebrations that had nothing to do with profit margins or market fluctuations. One afternoon in late October, as they sat watching clouds move across the sky, Eli asked a question that changed the direction of their relationship entirely. "Mr. Benton, do you ever get lonely in this big house all by yourself?" The directness of the question caught Henry off guard. Adults rarely asked such personal inquiries, especially not with Eli's gentle honesty that made it impossible to deflect or evade. "Yes," Henry said simply. "I get very lonely." "I thought so. Sometimes when I ride up the hill, I look at all these windows and think about how quiet it must be inside. At our apartment, there's always noise. Mama listening to music while she cooks, neighbors talking in the hallway, kids playing outside. Even when I'm alone, I'm not really alone because I can hear life happening all around me." Henry considered this perspective, realizing that his expensive mansion had been designed for privacy and exclusion rather than connection. The thick windows that blocked sound also blocked the sense of community that Eli described, the awareness of being part of something larger than individual existence. "Do you miss that? When you're here, I mean. The noise and activity?" "Not really, because you and I are making our own noise now, talking and laughing and being friends. But I think maybe you might be happier if you had more noise in your life. Good noise, I mean. People noise." The suggestion was so simple and obvious that Henry wondered why he hadn't considered it himself. In his grief, he had chosen isolation as protection, but protection from what? The world's continued existence despite his loss, other people's experiences of joy and sorrow and ordinary human connection. "How would I go about getting more people noise?" Henry asked, half joking but also genuinely curious. Eli brightened, clearly pleased that his suggestion was being taken seriously. "Well, you could start by opening your windows. Then maybe you could visit places where people gather, like parks or community centers or festivals. My neighborhood has lots of festivals. There's music and food, and everyone talks to everyone, even if they don't know each other." The idea of attending a neighborhood festival felt as foreign to Henry as traveling to another planet. His social interactions for the past year had been limited to medical professionals, service providers, and the occasional business call. The thought of being surrounded by strangers engaged in celebration rather than transaction was both terrifying and oddly appealing. Would you be willing to show me one of these festivals?" Henry asked hesitantly. Eli's smile could have powered the entire north side. "Really? You'd want to come to Pilsen?" "I think I would. If you think it would be appropriate. I don't want to intrude on your community." "Mr. Benton, our community loves meeting new people, especially people who want to learn about us instead of just looking at us. There's a Dia de los Muertos celebration next weekend. That's Day of the Dead, but it's not sad like it sounds. It's about remembering people we love who died, but celebrating their lives instead of just missing them." The timing felt significant in ways Henry couldn't quite articulate. A festival about remembering the dead while celebrating life, attended with a child who had taught him to laugh again, in a neighborhood where community meant taking care of each other rather than competing for resources. It seemed like exactly the kind of experience his isolated life had been missing. "I would be honored to attend with you, if you're sure it's appropriate." "It's perfect. And Mr. Benton, I think this is going to be really good for you." As Henry agreed to venture into the world beyond his mansion, for the first time in almost a year, he felt something he had nearly forgotten how to recognize: anticipation mixed with nervousness, the emotional cocktail that preceded new experiences and potential discoveries. Through his windows, Chicago's skyline glittered with the lights of millions of people living their lives, pursuing their dreams, building connections with each other. Soon, Henry thought as he watched Eli ride down the hill with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin, He would be part of that light rather than just observing it from a distance. The prospect was scary and exhilarating and long overdue. That night, as he read to Michael about a pirate who learned to navigate by starlight instead of familiar landmarks, Henry realized that he was finally ready to leave the harbor of his own grief and venture into uncharted waters. The journey might be dangerous, but staying anchored in the same place forever was its own kind of death. The festival preparation became a shared project that filled the week leading up to Dia de los Muertos with anticipation and nervous energy. Henry found himself researching the holiday's traditions and cultural significance, wanting to approach Eli's community with respect and understanding rather than tourist curiosity. "It's not like Halloween," Eli explained as they planned Henry's first venture beyond the mansion in nearly a year. "We don't try to scare people or pretend death is frightening. Instead, we remember that people we love are still with us in our hearts and memories, and we celebrate the good things they brought to our lives." The concept resonated with Henry in ways he hadn't expected. His relationship with grief had been entirely about loss. What was missing? What would never return? What had been taken away? The idea of honoring Sarah and celebrating the joy she had brought to his life represented a fundamental shift in perspective. "We build altars called ofrendas," Eli continued, "with pictures of people we want to remember and things they liked when they were alive. Mama and I make one for Papa every year. We put out his favorite foods and music, tools from when he worked construction, pictures of our family. It makes him feel close to us." Henry thought about the photographs throughout his mansion, formal portraits and candid shots that had become painful reminders of everything he had lost. When was the last time he had looked at a picture of Sarah and remembered her laughter instead of her absence? When had he stopped celebrating who she had been and started only mourning who she could no longer be? "Would it be appropriate for me to bring something to remember my wife?" Henry asked carefully. "Of course. That's exactly what Day of the Dead is for. What kinds of things did she love?" Henry closed his eyes, reaching past the grief to memories he had locked away for being too painful to access. "She loved sunflowers. She said they were optimistic flowers because they always turned toward the light. And she made this amazing banana bread that filled the whole house with warmth. She would bake extra loaves and give them to neighbors, especially when someone was going through a difficult time. Those sound perfect. Sunflowers and banana bread, things that made people happy." The simplicity of Eli's acceptance helped Henry begin to imagine Sarah's memory as something that could bring light rather than only darkness. Over the next few days, he found himself planning his contribution to the community altar with more enthusiasm than he had felt for any project in months. He ordered sunflowers from the florist who had once delivered weekly arrangements to his office, bright yellow blooms that seemed to carry their own sunshine. From his mansion's unused kitchen, he retrieved Sarah's handwritten banana bread recipe, carefully preserved in a cookbook that hadn't been opened since the accident. The act of touching something she had written, seeing her careful handwriting with its characteristic loops and flourishes, brought tears to his eyes. But they weren't entirely sad tears. The day of the festival dawned crisp and clear, with November sunshine that felt like a blessing on new beginnings. Henry dressed carefully, choosing clothes that were nice but not ostentatious. He wanted to show respect without looking like he was trying to display wealth. The sunflowers sat in a simple vase on his passenger seat as his driver navigated the route to Pilsen, a neighborhood Henry had invested in but never truly visited. Eli met him at the agreed-upon intersection, his bicycle locked to a street sign and his face glowing with excitement. "Mr. Benton, you came. I wasn't completely sure you would really come, but you did. I promised I would, and I always keep my promises." As they walked toward the festival site, Henry began to understand what Eli had meant about community noise. The streets pulsed with activity, families carrying colorful decorations, children in face paint that transformed them into beautiful skulls, musicians practicing songs that would honor the dead through celebration of life. The sounds weren't chaotic, but symphonic, individual voices and activities combining into something larger and more meaningful than their separate parts. The festival itself was unlike anything Henry had ever experienced. Vendors sold traditional foods whose scents created an olfactory map of Mexican heritage. The salt and lime of elote, the cinnamon sweetness of churros, the rich complexity of mole that spoke of recipes passed down through generations. Artists painted children's faces with intricate calavera designs that turned death into beauty, while musicians played songs that seemed to bridge the gap between earth and heaven. At the center of the celebration stood the community ofrenda, a massive altar decorated with thousands of marigold petals that created rivers of orange and yellow flowing between photographs, candles, and personal mementos. Henry approached with his sunflowers, feeling suddenly shy about his contribution to this deeply personal community ritual. "Those are beautiful," said a woman's voice behind him. Henry turned to find a middle-aged Latina woman with kind eyes and work-worn hands. "I'm Maria, Eli's mother. He's told me so much about you." Henry felt his face flush with unexpected nervousness. "I hope he's said good things. He's been such a wonderful friend to me. He said you fixed a bicycle for him, but more than that, you listened to him. You made him feel like his words mattered. That's not always easy to find in adults." The acceptance in Maria's voice surprised Henry. He had expected suspicion, or at least curiosity, about why a wealthy man from Lincoln Park would befriend her young son. Instead, she seemed to be evaluating him based on how he had treated Eli, rather than what he represented in terms of social or economic difference. "Your son has taught me more than I taught him," Henry said honestly. "He's shown me things about kindness and community that I had forgotten I needed to learn." Maria nodded as if this made perfect sense to her. Children are good teachers if we pay attention to what they're trying to show us. "Eli said you wanted to put something for your wife on the altar?" Henry held up the sunflowers, feeling vulnerable in a way that reminded him of Eli's courage in knocking on his door. "She loved these. She said they were optimistic flowers. She sounds like she was a wise woman. Come on, let's find the perfect spot for them." Together, they placed the sunflowers among the other offerings, the bright yellow petals somehow finding harmony with marigolds and roses and plastic flowers that represented love regardless of their material value. Henry stood back, looking at Sarah's flowers surrounded by the community's memories, and felt something release in his chest that had been held tight for almost a year. "She's part of our celebration now," Maria said softly. "Part of our community of memory." The afternoon passed in a blur of sensory experiences that overwhelmed and delighted Henry in equal measure. He tried traditional foods that expanded his understanding of comfort beyond familiar flavors, listened to stories about ancestors and achievements that painted pictures of lives lived with dignity despite struggle, watched children play games that seemed to span cultures and generations. But the most powerful moment came when Eli led him to a smaller altar dedicated specifically to fathers who had died too young. Among the photographs and mementos, Henry saw a picture of Eli with a man who shared his gentle eyes and generous smile. "That's my papa," Eli said simply. "Michael Morales. He would have liked you, Mr. Benton. He always said the best people were the ones who knew how to listen and weren't afraid to help." Henry stared at the photo, seeing the love between father and son captured in a moment of shared joy. Michael Morales wore work clothes and had calloused hands, but his face radiated the same warmth and integrity that Henry had come to associate with his son. "I think I would have liked him too," Henry said. "He raised an extraordinary boy. He taught me that death doesn't end love, it just changes how we carry it. That's why today isn't sad. We're not saying goodbye to people, we're saying hello to the parts of them that live in us." The wisdom in Eli's words hit Henry like revelation. For months he had been trapped in goodbye, paralyzed by the permanence of Sarah's absence and Michael's silence. But perhaps grief didn't have to be about endings. Perhaps it could be about integration, about finding ways to carry love forward instead of leaving it buried with the past. As the sun began to set over Pilsen, painting the festival in golden light that made everything seem touched by magic, Henry felt a profound shift in his understanding of community, memory, and hope. He was no longer just observing other people's lives from behind glass walls. He was participating, contributing, being welcomed into a circle of shared human experience that had room for everyone, regardless of their background or losses. "Thank you," he said to Eli as they prepared to leave. "This has been one of the most meaningful days of my life." "Thank you for coming, and for bringing your wife's flowers. She made our altar more beautiful." As Henry's driver navigated the route back to Lincoln Park, he carried with him more than memories of a pleasant afternoon. He carried a new understanding of what community could mean, what celebration in the face of loss looked like, and how love could be honored through connection rather than isolation. The mansion felt different when he returned. Not smaller or more empty, but quieter in a purposeful way rather than an abandoned way. It was a place of reflection rather than hiding, a sanctuary where he could process experiences and plan connections rather than simply enduring solitude. That night, as he sat beside Michael's bed, reading about pirates who learned that treasure came in many forms, Henry began to plan changes that would honor what he had learned. Windows that could open to community sound, spaces that could welcome friends rather than isolating him from them, ways to use his resources not just as protection, but as tools for building the kind of connections that made life meaningful. The festival had shown him that healing didn't require forgetting or moving on. It required integration and purpose and the courage to remain open to love in new forms. Thanks to a 9-year-old boy with his father's bicycle and his own generous heart, Henry was finally ready to begin that kind of healing. November settled over Chicago with the kind of crisp clarity that made the city feel newly minted, and Henry found himself experiencing each day with senses that seemed sharper than they had been in months. The festival had awakened something in him that he hadn't realized was sleeping, a capacity for connection that extended beyond the boundaries of his own loss. Eli continued his daily visits, but now their conversations carried the warmth of shared experience. They talked about the people they had met at the festival, the foods they had tried, the music that still echoed in their memories. More importantly, they began planning ways to extend the community connection beyond a single-day celebration. "Mrs. Rodriguez still needs help with her groceries," Eli mentioned during one of their afternoon talks, "and there are other people in the neighborhood who could use assistance but are too proud to ask for it directly." Henry found himself drawn into these logistical conversations with the same strategic thinking he had once applied to business ventures, but with completely different motivations. Instead of calculating profit margins, he was considering impact measurements. How many people could be helped? What kinds of assistance would preserve dignity while providing support? How resources could be deployed most effectively to strengthen community bonds? "What if we created a system?" Henry suggested. "Something that connected people who needed help with people who could provide it, but in a way that felt like mutual aid rather than charity?" Eli's eyes lit up with the same enthusiasm he had shown when discussing his bicycle. "Like a neighborhood network where everyone contributes something and everyone receives something." "Exactly. Your bicycle could be part of the transportation infrastructure. People with cars could provide rides. Those with specific skills could offer services. Everyone would be both a giver and a receiver." The idea began to take shape through their conversations, evolving from abstract concept to practical possibility. Henry discovered that his business experience was useful after all, but in ways he had never anticipated. Project management skills translated perfectly to community organizing. Financial planning knowledge helped with resource coordination. His network of professional contacts could provide services and support that individual community members couldn't access on their own. But more than his professional skills, Henry found that his mansion could serve purposes beyond protecting his privacy. The building had meeting spaces that could host neighborhood gatherings. His unused kitchen could support community dinners. The circular driveway could accommodate events that brought people together around shared goals. "Would your mother be comfortable with meetings here?" Henry asked Eli one afternoon as they sketched preliminary plans for what they were calling the Pilsen Neighborhood Network. "I think so. She's been watching how you treat me. And she can tell you're not trying to use your money to control things or make people feel small. She said you remind her of Papa in some ways. Someone who has more than others but doesn't let that make him forget what really matters. The comparison to Michael Morales felt like the highest compliment Henry had ever received. To be seen as someone who understood what really mattered, despite his wealth rather than because of it, represented a fundamental shift in how he defined success. The first community meeting took place in Henry's mansion on a cold November evening, with 15 neighbors gathered in his living room around coffee and Maria's homemade tamales. The contrast between the formal elegance of his furnishings and the warm informality of community conversation created an atmosphere that felt both comfortable and significant. Henry had been nervous about hosting, worried that his home's obvious wealth might make people uncomfortable or create an imbalance of power that would undermine the collaborative spirit they were trying to foster. But Eli had been right about his community's ability to focus on intention rather than appearance. The neighbors who gathered seemed more interested in discussing practical solutions to shared challenges than in evaluating his interior decoration choices. "My grandmother needs rides to her doctor appointments," said Carlos, the teenager whose bicycle had originally inspired Eli's request. "She doesn't like to ask for help, but the bus takes 2 hours each way and she gets tired." "I could drive her," offered Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman Eli had helped with groceries. "I have a car and I'm retired. It would give me something useful to do." "My uncle owns a small grocery store," added Maria. "He could provide fresh produce for people who have trouble getting to the market, if we had a way to coordinate deliveries and payment." Henry listened to these exchanges with growing amazement at the abundance of resources and generosity that existed within the community. People weren't lacking in willingness to help each other. They were lacking in systems that made such help easy to coordinate and sustainable over time. "What if we created a simple database?" Henry suggested. "Something that tracked who needed what kind of help and who could provide what kind of assistance. Not complicated, just organized enough that we could match resources with needs efficiently." The suggestion was met with enthusiasm, and by the end of the evening, they had outlined a basic structure for their neighborhood network. Transportation assistance, grocery delivery, home maintenance, child care support, language tutoring, a web of mutual aid that would strengthen every strand by connecting them all together. As the neighbors prepared to leave, Mrs. Rodriguez approached Henry with the kind of direct honesty he had learned to associate with Eli's community. "Mr. Benton, I want to thank you for opening your home to us, but I also want to ask, what do you get out of this? We appreciate your help, but we want to make sure this is sustainable for you too." The question was fair, and showed the kind of practical wisdom that looked beyond immediate gratitude to long-term relationship dynamics. Henry considered his answer carefully, wanting to be as honest as Mrs. Rodriguez had been. "I get to feel useful again," he said finally. "For the past year, I've been living like my life was over, like nothing I did mattered, because I couldn't fix the things that hurt the most. This network gives me a way to contribute to something meaningful, to be part of a community instead of isolated from it. It's not charity on my part, it's participation." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded with satisfaction. "Good. Communities work best when everyone has a role, when everyone benefits. We'll make this work because it works for all of us." December brought the first snow of the season and with it the network's first real test. A severe weather system moved through Chicago, bringing temperatures that made basic activities dangerous for vulnerable community members. But instead of people suffering in isolation, the Pilsen Neighborhood Network activated with the efficiency of a well-designed business operation. Eli's bicycle became the communications hub, carrying messages between households that needed assistance and those that could provide it. Henry's mansion served as a warming center for families whose heat had been cut off due to utility issues. Maria coordinated food distribution from her kitchen, while Mrs. Chen drove elderly neighbors to medical appointments that couldn't be postponed despite the weather. Henry found himself more actively engaged than he had been in any business venture. He used his financial resources to pay outstanding utility bills without fanfare, arranged emergency home repairs through his contractor contacts, and opened his doors to children who needed a safe place to stay while their parents worked jobs that couldn't be missed, even during dangerous weather. But the most significant moment came when Eli arrived at the mansion during the storm's worst evening, his bicycle abandoned at the foot of the driveway because the roads had become too dangerous to ride. "Mr. Benton," Eli said as he stamped snow off his boots in the mansion's entryway, "there's a family on my block, the Garcias. Their heat went out and they have a baby. The utility company can't come until tomorrow, and it's getting really cold." Henry didn't hesitate. "Bring them here. There's plenty of room, and the house is warm." Within an hour, the Garcia family, parents in their 20s with a 6-month-old daughter, were settled in one of the mansion's guest bedrooms, the baby's cries echoing through halls that had been silent for too long. Henry found himself remembering skills he had forgotten he possessed, helping to warm bottles and fold baby clothes, contributing to the kind of domestic crisis management that no business school had ever taught him. "This is very kind of you, Mr. Benton," said Mrs. Garcia as she nursed her daughter in the mansion's sunroom. "We don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me. This is what neighbors do for each other." The words felt natural coming out of his mouth, but later that night, Henry realized how profound the shift they represented actually was. He had moved from thinking of himself as a wealthy individual who occasionally helped less fortunate people to seeing himself as a neighbor who contributed to a community where everyone looked out for everyone else. The snow continued for 3 days, and during that time Henry's mansion became an unofficial community center. Children played in rooms that had been empty for months. Adults shared stories and skills and meals that turned strangers into friends. The formal elegance of his furnishings became background to the informal warmth of human connection. On the storm's final evening, as families prepared to return to homes that had been repaired and warmed, Henry sat in his study with Eli, both of them exhausted but energized by what they had accomplished together. "Mr. Benton," Eli said, curled up in a leather chair with a book about adventure stories, "do you know what I think happened this week?" "What's that?" "I think you found your treasure." Henry looked around his study, seeing not expensive decorations but evidence of the life he had built over the past few months. Thank you notes from neighbors, photographs from community events, plans for network expansion drawn on the same kinds of legal pads he had once used for business strategies. "I think you're right," he said. "But I couldn't have found it without your help." "That's the best kind of treasure," Eli replied with the wisdom that never failed to surprise Henry. "The kind you can only find by sharing it with other people." As December progressed toward the holidays, Henry realized that he had undergone a transformation more complete than he could have imagined when Eli first knocked on his door. He was still wealthy, still lived in a mansion, still had access to resources that most people could only dream of. But wealth no longer defined him or isolated him. Instead, it had become a tool for connection, a means of contributing to something larger and more meaningful than individual accumulation. The network had grown beyond Pilsen, attracting attention from other Chicago neighborhoods interested in replicating the model. Henry found himself consulting on community organizing projects, sharing his experience with groups that wanted to create their own mutual aid systems. His business skills were relevant again, but in service of goals that made him proud to wake up each morning. Most importantly, the mansion had been transformed from a tomb for grief into a living space where community happened naturally. The stopped clocks still read 3:07, but now they seemed less like markers of an ending and more like reminders that time could be redeemed, that moments of loss could become foundations for moments of connection. On Christmas Eve, as Henry prepared for the neighborhood's holiday celebration that would fill his home with more joy than it had ever contained, he went to check on Michael. His son lay as still as ever, maintained by machines that measured life in steady electronic rhythms. But something was different, and it took Henry a moment to realize what had changed. One of the clocks in Michael's room, a small digital display on the medical equipment, was no longer frozen at 3:07. Instead, it showed the correct time, its numbers changing with each passing minute. Henry stared at the display, his heart racing with a combination of hope and disbelief. As he watched, Michael's eyelids fluttered. Not much, barely noticeable, but definitely movement. Henry held his breath, afraid that acknowledging what he was seeing might make it disappear. But there it was again, a subtle shift that suggested awareness, connection, the possibility of return. "Michael," Henry whispered, reaching for his son's hand, "can you hear me?" The response was almost imperceptible, a slight pressure against his palm, a tightening of fingers that had been still for over a year. But it was real, undeniable, a miracle that felt less like magic and more like the natural result of creating space for love to work. Henry pressed the call button for Michael's medical team, his hands shaking with excitement and fear and overwhelming gratitude. Through the mansion's walls, he could hear the sounds of preparation for the evening's celebration, voices and laughter, and the clatter of dishes being arranged for a feast that would welcome the entire community. As he waited for the doctors to arrive, Henry continued to hold his son's hand, feeling the faint but steady pulse of connection that suggested healing was possible after all. Outside, snow began to fall again, but this time it looked like blessing rather than burden, covering Chicago in white that made the city seem newly born. The pirates in the stories he had been reading were right, Henry realized. The greatest treasures were often hidden in the most unexpected places, discovered not through conquest, but through the courage to open closed doors and trust in possibilities that couldn't be calculated or controlled. Through the window he could see Eli's blue bicycle propped against the mansion's front steps, waiting for its next adventure. Tomorrow, Henry thought as he felt his son's fingers move again against his palm, they would have new stories to tell about miracles that came disguised as 9-year-old boys asking for used bicycles, about communities that formed when people chose connection over isolation, about love that persisted even when everything seemed lost. The clock on Michael's medical equipment continued to mark correct time, each second a step forward into a future that finally felt worth anticipating. And in the gathering darkness of Christmas Eve, Henry Benton understood that he had found his way home, not to a place, but to a way of being in the world that honored both loss and hope, both memory and possibility. The months that followed Michael's awakening felt like watching someone emerge from deep water, slow, sometimes setbacks, but with steady progress toward full consciousness. The medical team called it remarkable, unprecedented, a recovery they couldn't fully explain through conventional understanding of brain trauma. Henry preferred Eli's interpretation. Sometimes people just need to hear that it's safe to come back to the world. Michael's rehabilitation became another community project, with neighbors taking turns reading to him, sharing stories about their lives and families, filling his room with the sounds of human connection that seemed to draw him steadily toward full awareness. Mrs. Rodriguez brought traditional healing teas her grandmother had taught her to make. Carlos played guitar and sang songs in both English and Spanish. Maria contributed fresh flowers from her small apartment garden, filling the medical equipment's sterile atmosphere with colors and scents that spoke of life continuing. Henry watched these interactions with growing amazement at how naturally his neighbors had absorbed his son into their circle of care. They didn't treat Michael as a tragic figure or an object of pity, but as a community member whose recovery was everyone's shared investment and celebration. People heal faster when they're surrounded by love, Maria observed one afternoon as she helped Henry arrange fresh sunflowers. Sarah's favorite flowers had become a weekly tradition in Michael's room. It's not magic, it's just human nature. We're not meant to go through difficult times alone. By spring, Michael was speaking in short sentences, asking questions about the year he had missed, expressing curiosity about the community that had formed around his family during his absence. His personality was emerging slowly but recognizably, the same gentle humor that had characterized him before the accident, the same intelligence now focused on understanding how his father's life had changed so dramatically. "Dad," "Tell me about Eli," Michael said one May afternoon as they sat together in the mansion's garden, watching neighbors plant vegetables in raised beds that Henry had installed as part of the network's food security project. Henry looked at his son's face. Thinner than it had been, marked by the struggle of recovery, but alive with interest and affection, and felt the familiar warmth that Eli's presence had brought to his life. "Eli saved us," Henry said simply. "He knocked on our door when we needed him most, asked for something small, and taught us how to be part of the world again." Michael nodded thoughtfully, his gaze following Eli as the boy rode his blue bicycle between the garden beds, delivering supplies and messages with the same efficiency he had shown from their first meeting. "He looks like he belongs here," Michael observed. "He does. We all do now." The community network had grown beyond anything Henry had initially envisioned. What had started as neighborhood mutual aid had evolved into a model that attracted attention from urban planners and social workers across the Midwest. Henry found himself speaking at conferences about community building, sharing stage time with people like Maria and Mrs. Rodriguez, whose practical wisdom provided context for his organizational strategies. But more meaningful than the external recognition was the internal transformation that continued to unfold in Henry's daily life. His mansion had become a genuinely public space, with different rooms serving different community functions throughout each week. The formal dining room hosted neighborhood association meetings. The library became a homework center where high school students tutored younger children. The kitchen supported cooking classes where Maria taught traditional recipes while learning about financial planning from Henry. "You know what I love most about this?" Eli said one evening as they worked together in the garden, harvesting tomatoes that would be distributed to families throughout Pilsen. "Everyone gets to be good at something. Everyone gets to teach, and everyone gets to learn." Henry paused in his picking, struck by how perfectly Eli had captured the network's most successful element. In traditional charity models, some people gave and others received, creating hierarchies that often undermined the dignity the assistance was meant to preserve. But in their community system, everyone contributed skills, resources, time, or knowledge that others needed. The exchange was circular rather than linear, sustainable rather than dependent. "You're going to make an excellent community organizer someday," Henry told the boy. "Maybe. Or maybe I'll be something totally different. But either way, I want to keep bringing people together. That's what Papa would have wanted, for me to use whatever I'm good at to help people feel less alone." As summer approached, Henry realized that he had been living a completely different life for almost a year. The grief over Sarah's death hadn't disappeared, but it had been integrated into a broader understanding of love's persistence across different forms. His worry about Michael's future had been replaced by active participation in that future's creation. His wealth had transformed from a shield against the world into a bridge connecting him to community. The stopped clocks throughout the mansion remained at 3:07, but their meaning had evolved. Instead of marking the moment when everything ended, they now commemorated the moment when everything changed, when loss became the foundation for rebuilding rather than the conclusion to living. On the anniversary of the accident, Henry and Michael visited Sarah's grave together for the first time since her funeral. They brought sunflowers, banana bread baked from her recipe, and stories about the community that had grown around their healing. The cemetery felt less like a place of endings and more like a place of connection. To memory, to each other, to the ongoing project of honoring love through action. "Do you think she would approve of what we've built?" Michael asked as they arranged flowers on Sarah's headstone. Henry thought about his wife's dreams for their family, her hopes that their wealth would be used to bring people together rather than isolate them from genuine connection. He thought about her habit of sharing banana bread with neighbors, her insistence that hospitality was the highest expression of gratitude for abundance. "I think she would say we finally found the point of having money," Henry replied. "Not to buy things, but to buy time and space and opportunity for love to work in the world." As they walked back toward the mansion, Henry felt a deep sense of completion that had nothing to do with endings and everything to do with integration. The broken man who had sat in isolation, counting losses and waiting for nothing, had been replaced by someone who understood that healing was possible, that community was essential, that even the greatest tragedies could become foundations for unexpected grace. That evening, as community members gathered in the mansion's garden for their weekly shared meal, Henry stood at his window watching bicycles and cars arrive, listening to voices and laughter fill the air that had been silent for so long. Eli rode up the driveway on his blue bicycle, followed by Maria carrying a casserole dish, followed by neighbors whose names and stories had become as familiar as family. At exactly 3:07 p.m., Henry walked over to one of the stopped clocks, and, for the first time in almost 2 years, he reset it to the correct time. The action felt both symbolic and practical, an acknowledgement that he was ready to live in the present rather than remaining frozen in the past. The clock's hands moved forward, joining the flow of time that connected future to present to memory in patterns more complex and hopeful than Henry had ever imagined possible. Outside, Chicago pulsed with the lives of millions of people pursuing their own versions of happiness, healing, and connection. And inside the mansion on the hill, a community gathered to share food and stories and the simple miracle of showing up for each other, day after day, season after season, in all the ordinary and extraordinary moments that make a life worth living. 3 years had passed since Eli first knocked on Henry's door with his request for a used bicycle, and the mansion on the hill had become something unprecedented in Lincoln Park. A wealthy residence that functioned as a genuine community center. The transformation was so complete that city planners now brought visitors to study their model of resource sharing across economic divides. But for Henry, standing in his garden on a perfect September morning, watching his son Michael teach a group of neighborhood children how to identify different types of butterflies, the most remarkable change was immeasurable by any external standard. He had learned to wake up eager for the day's possibilities, rather than dreading another round of empty hours. "Mr. Benton," called Eli, now 12 years old, and riding a newer bicycle that he had earned through his work as the network's official communications coordinator. Mrs. Chen called. "Her grandson is visiting from college and wants to talk to you about starting something like this in Boston." Henry smiled, drying his hands on a gardening towel as he walked toward Eli. The boy had grown taller, his voice beginning to change, but he retained the same earnest enthusiasm that had first disarmed Henry's cynicism years ago. "Boston, That's quite a distance for our ideas to travel." "Ideas have wings," Eli replied with the matter-of-fact wisdom that still caught Henry off guard. "Especially good ideas that help people. Papa used to say that kindness spreads faster than anything else in the world if you give it room to run." The mention of Michael Morales still brought a gentle sadness to conversations, but it was sadness mixed with gratitude rather than pure loss. Eli had learned to carry his father's memory as inspiration rather than burden, much as Henry had learned to carry Sarah's love as energy for future connection rather than monument to past happiness. "Speaking of your papa," Henry said, "I have something to show you." He led Eli to the mansion's newly completed community room, where a wall display honored the network's origins and evolution. Among photographs of neighborhood events and testimonials from beneficiaries, a central plaque bore a simple inscription, "In memory of Michael Morales, who taught his son that the best way to honor love is to share it with the world, and in celebration of that son, Eli, whose courage to ask for help reminded us all that community begins with conversation." Eli stared at the plaque, his eyes reflecting the complex emotions of a child who had grown up faster than necessary, but without losing his fundamental optimism about human nature. "It's beautiful, Mr. Benton, but you know what? I think Papa would say the real memorial is all the people we've helped who are now helping other people. That's how love stays alive in the world." Henry nodded, understanding that Eli had grasped something about legacy that most adults never learned. Sarah's love lived in the banana bread recipe that Maria now taught to other community members. Michael Morales's love lived in his son's generous heart and in every act of kindness that heart inspired. Their own project's value would ultimately be measured not by its immediate impact, but by how many other communities it motivated to discover their own capacity for mutual care. That afternoon brought familiar rhythm: school dismissal followed by children arriving at the mansion for homework help and afternoon snacks, adults stopping by to coordinate evening activities and weekend projects, the comfortable chaos of a space where individual needs connected into collective purpose. Henry had long since stopped being surprised by how naturally wealth could serve community when deployed with intention rather than ego. His mansion's operating costs hadn't increased significantly despite serving dozens of people daily. If anything, sharing resources had proved more efficient than maintaining them in isolation. The building felt more alive, more valuable, more like the investment Sarah had once hoped it would become. Michael, now 18 and preparing for college with plans to study social work, had become the network's unofficial historian, documenting their model in preparation for replication elsewhere. His recovery had been complete enough that only people who knew his history could detect any remaining effects from his long coma. More remarkably, he spoke about that period not as lost time but as preparation for understanding what community support could accomplish when consistently applied. "Dad," Michael said as they prepared dinner for that evening's community meal, "I've been thinking about why our approach works when so many other programs fail." Henry looked up from chopping vegetables, always eager to hear his son's analysis of their shared project. "Most assistance programs are based on fixing people's problems," Michael continued, "but our network is based on recognizing people's strengths. Everyone has something valuable to contribute, even when they also have genuine needs. The help flows in multiple directions instead of just one." The observation was astute enough to make Henry pause his food preparation. Michael had identified the philosophical foundation that made their network sustainable in ways that traditional charity often wasn't. By recognizing abundance even within scarcity, by acknowledging that everyone possessed resources that others needed, they had created systems that built dignity rather than undermining it. That's exactly right, and it took a 9-year-old boy to teach me the difference. Eli's pretty wise. But Dad, I think you were ready to learn. The accident didn't just hurt us. It broke down the walls that kept us from seeing how much we needed other people. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us become doorways to the best things we never could have imagined. Henry looked at his son's face, seeing Sarah's eyes and his own stubborn chin, but most clearly seeing the kind of mature wisdom that could only come from experiencing genuine hardship and emerging with increased, rather than decreased, faith in human possibility. As evening approached and community members began arriving for their weekly shared meal, Henry felt the familiar satisfaction of participating in something larger than individual existence. The dining room filled with conversations in multiple languages, laughter that crossed cultural boundaries, children playing with the unconscious inclusivity that adults often had to work to achieve. Eli arrived with his mother, both of them carrying dishes that filled the air with scents that had become synonymous with belonging. Maria had become the network's informal coordinator, her natural leadership skills and deep community connections making her indispensable to their continued growth. Her partnership with Henry had evolved into genuine friendship based on shared commitment rather than complementary resources. "Henry," Maria said as they worked together to arrange serving tables, "I got a call today from a reporter who wants to write about our innovative approach to urban community building. Should I talk to her?" Henry considered the question seriously. Public attention had benefits. It could inspire replication and attract resources for expansion, but it also carried risks of oversimplification, of reducing their lived experience of community to sound bites that missed essential nuances. "What do you think? You understand this community better than I do." "I think we should tell our story, but tell it completely, not just the success parts, but the difficult parts too. The times when people disagreed, or when help was offered badly, or when good intentions created unexpected problems. Real community isn't perfect community." Maria's wisdom reminded Henry why their partnership worked so well. She brought practical understanding of how people actually lived and connected, while he contributed organizational systems and resource access. Neither could have created what they had built without the other, and both had grown in ways that individual effort could never have achieved. As dinner concluded and evening activities began, children playing board games while adults planned the following week's schedule, Henry found himself in the mansion's garden with Eli, both of them looking up at stars that were visible despite Chicago's light pollution. "Mr. Benton," Eli said, his voice carrying the thoughtful tone that usually preceded his most important observations, "do you ever think about how different everything would be if I hadn't come up that hill to ask for a bicycle?" Henry considered the question, trying to imagine alternatives to the life he now lived. Would Michael have recovered without community support to draw him back to consciousness? Would Henry have remained isolated in grief until it consumed whatever remained of his capacity for joy? Would the neighbors he now considered family have continued struggling with individual challenges that could have been addressed through collective effort? "I think about it often," Henry admitted, "but here's what I've learned. Everything that happened was possible because you had the courage to ask for help, and I had finally become desperate enough to say yes. The miracle wasn't mysterious. It was two people choosing connection over isolation." "Maybe that's what miracles really are," Eli mused. "Not impossible things happening, but possible things finally being allowed to happen because people get brave enough to try." As they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of community settling into evening rhythms, Henry reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A billionaire's grief and a 9-year-old's hope had collided into something neither could have created alone, a model of mutual aid that proved abundance could be cultivated even in the midst of struggle, that healing was possible even after devastating loss, that community could bridge any divide when people chose relationship over separation. The blue bicycle that had started everything leaned against the mansion's front steps, still Eli's primary mode of transportation despite his increased height and responsibilities. It remained a perfect metaphor for their entire project, something used, something with history, something that gained value through service rather than display. "Eli," Henry said as they prepared to join the others inside, "I want you to know that asking me for a bicycle was the best business proposal I ever received." "Really? What kind of return on investment did you get?" Henry looked through the mansion's windows at the life he now lived, Michael healthy and purposeful, neighbors who had become family, days filled with meaningful work, nights peaceful with the satisfaction of contribution rather than accumulation. "The kind that can't be measured in dollars," he said, echoing words he had spoken years ago without fully understanding their meaning. "The kind that keeps paying dividends long after you've forgotten the original investment." As Chicago settled into another night of individual dreams and shared hopes, the community that had grown around a simple request for transportation continued its quiet work of proving that love, multiplied through generosity and sustained by commitment, could transform any loss into foundation for unexpected grace. Years later, when urban planning students studied the Lincoln Park Community Network as an example of successful resource sharing across economic divides, they would focus on organizational structures, funding mechanisms, and replication strategies. But the people who had lived the experience knew that its real success had grown from something much simpler and more profound. The recognition that everyone needs help sometimes, everyone has help to offer, and community happens when people choose to see those truths as opportunities for connection rather than threats to independence. In his final journal entry about the project, Henry wrote, "I spent my career learning how to accumulate wealth, but it took a child with a bicycle to teach me how to invest in happiness. The return on that investment continues to compound daily, and I expect it will keep growing long after I'm gone, carried forward by everyone whose life was touched by one small boy's courage to ask for help and one broken man's willingness to say yes." The story that had begun with silence and ended with community remained eternally present in the continued lives of everyone it had touched, a reminder that the greatest treasures are often discovered, not through seeking, but through sharing, not through achieving, but through serving, not through having, but through giving. And you? Have you ever met someone small who changed your life in an immense way? Perhaps a child whose simple request opened doors you didn't know were closed? Maybe a neighbor whose need became your opportunity to discover gifts you hadn't realized you possessed? I invite you to think about the bicycle in your own story. That simple request, that moment of connection, that choice to say yes when saying no would have been easier. Community begins with conversation. Healing starts with hope, and miracles happen when people decide that serving each other is the highest return on investment life can offer. Tell me your story in the comments below. Share the moment when someone's courage to ask for help met your willingness to provide it. If this story touched your heart, touched something deep inside that remembers what really matters, leave a like and subscribe so this message can reach other souls who also need to believe again in the power of simple kindness to transform everything. Because sometimes all it takes to change the world is one person willing to ask and another person ready to answer. With love, with generosity, and with the faith that miracles are not impossible things happening, but possible things finally being allowed to happen when people get brave enough to try.